In the spring of 2019, inside a cramped, smoke-filled office in the Tamil district of Kathmandu, a transaction took place that would seal the fate of 11 human beings before they had even stepped onto a glacier. A man named Lucas, a middle-aged accountant from Ohio with a savings account full of dreams and a body softened by desk work, handed over a stack of cash, significantly less than the industry standard, to an operator named Mohan. In the high-stakes world of Himalayan mountaineering, there is a saying that you get what you pay for, but Lucas believed he had found a loophole in the death zone. He believed he had found a bargain. He was purchasing a permit to stand on the roof of the world, but in reality, he was purchasing a place in a queue for a slow, suffocating execution. By the time the monsoon clouds rolled in 3 weeks later, Lucas would be frozen into the ice of the South Cone, stepping over bodies that looked suspiciously like his own, while Mohan counted the profit in a warm ledger thousands of feet below. But this isn't just the story of Lucas. It is the story of a systemic rot that has infected the holiest mountain on earth. It is a story of oxygen tanks filled in back alleys, of Sherpas hired off the streets with no experience, and of a guiding philosophy that views human life as a renewable resource. Before we unravel the specific timeline of this disaster, we must understand the machinery of greed that built it. We must look at the fine print of the contract signed in blood. What happened in the weeks leading up to the 2019 season wasn't an accident. It was a mathematical inevitability calculated by men who never intended to climb. The winds on Everest howl with a specific frequency, a sound that seasoned climbers say resembles a jet engine that never takes off. But in 2019, underneath that roar, there was the quieter, deadlier sound of corners being cut. It began not with an avalanche, but with a brochure promising the summit for half the price. This is the story of the most greedy operators in the history of Everest, and the terrifying cost of a discount expedition. Before we go into next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this, moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If 1,000 of you are watching, I hope all thousands of you join us, because this community is growing, and your presence truly matters here. So, to understand the mechanics of this tragedy, one must first understand the economics of the death zone. For decades, climbing Mount Everest was the reserve of the elite. Expeditions run by Western companies, charging upwards of $65,000, sometimes $80,000 per head. These fees covered intricate logistics, proven oxygen systems, redundant radios, medical doctors at base camp, and, most crucially, Sherpas who had summited 10, 15, or 20 times. It was a rich man's game, certainly, but it was a game played with a safety net woven from money and expertise. But in the early 2010s, a shift occurred. A new breed of operator emerged from the shadows of the local market. These were not the storied climbing houses of the past. These were budget startups, engaging in a race to the bottom that would terrify any regulator in the Western world. They offered the summit for $30,000, then $25,000, undercutting the established safety protocols by slashing the overhead that keeps people alive. They realized that the mountain doesn't charge for admission, only the government does, and everything else was negotiable. The operator in our story, a composite of the worst practices seen that season, viewed oxygen not as a life support system, but as inventory. In a legitimate expedition, a climber is allocated a specific flow rate, 4 liters per minute usually, ensuring their blood stays oxygenated enough to prevent the brain from swelling inside the skull. The budget operators did the math. If they dialed the regulators back, if they provided recycled tanks from the Russian black market, if they claimed a tank was full when it was only 3/4 pressurized, they could save thousands of dollars per team. This calculation is invisible at sea level. In the office in Kathmandu, the client sees a shiny orange cylinder and assumes it is their lifeline. They do not know that the valve is sticky. They do not know that the mix is impure. They do not know that the regulator they are handed has been retrieved from a corpse on a previous expedition, wiped down, and placed back in the pile. The greed here is not dramatic. It is bureaucratic. It is the banality of evil written into a supply list. When Lucas signed his papers, he wasn't just buying a cheap climb. He was agreeing to play Russian roulette with a gun he didn't know was loaded. The illusion of safety is a powerful narcotic. When the clients arrived at base camp, the budget operator had set the stage beautifully. There were dining tents with heaters, decent food, and a facade of organization. It is easy to make a camp look professional at 17,500 feet. Nylon and aluminum look the same, whether they cost $100 or $1,000. But the rot was hidden in the equipment tents, buried under tarps where the clients were not allowed to look. Among the gear piles lay the zombie cylinders. These were oxygen bottles that had technically expired years ago, their composite shells weakened by UV exposure and rough handling. A reputable operator retires these bottles. A greedy operator sees them as pure profit. They were repainted, restickered, and stacked alongside the few new bottles to create a visual lie. The regulators, the mechanical devices that reduced the tank's immense pressure to a breathable flow, were mismatched and aging. A failure of a regulator at 28,000 feet is not an inconvenience. It is a sentence of immediate hypoxia, leading to unconsciousness and death within minutes. Furthermore, the radios were scarce. In a high-end expedition, every climber, guide, and Sherpa has a radio. Communication is constant. In this budget camp, there were perhaps 3 radios for a team of 15. The logic was simple. The clients don't need to talk. They just need to follow the person in front of them. This silence would prove catastrophic. It meant that when trouble started, it would happen in a vacuum. A client struggling in the back of the line would have no way to call the lead guide. They would simply fade away into the snow, their absence unnoticed until the next head count at camp, hours too late. The operator relied on the statistical probability of survival. They banked on good weather and luck. They treated Everest like a theme park ride that occasionally breaks down, rather than a hostile environment that actively tries to kill biological life. The clients, blinded by their ambition and the deal they had secured, walked past the piles of rusted gear, seeing only the mountain looming above, unaware that their life support systems were already failing before they had taken a single step. Perhaps the most tragic victims of this economic brutality were not the clients, but the workers. The Sherpa people have become synonymous with Everest, revered for their physiological adaptation to altitude and their incredible strength. But Sherpa is an ethnic group, not a job title, and certainly not a guarantee of mountaineering skill. A seasoned, fully certified climbing Sherpa, one who has trained at the Khumbu Climbing Center and has multiple summits, commands a high wage. They are the pilots of the mountain. To offer a climb at rock-bottom prices, the greedy operator cannot afford these pilots. Instead, they hired what the industry darky refers to as paper Sherpas. These were young men, some teenagers, from low-altitude villages deep in the valleys. They were strong, yes, and they needed the money desperately to support families in a poverty-stricken economy. But many had never worn crampons before. Many had never been above base camp. They were given a crash course in ice axe usage in a parking lot, handed a heavy load, and told to follow the rope. These young men were not guides. They were beasts of burden, exploited for their ethnicity and their desperation. They were expected to manage wealthy, exhausted, and often delusional Western clients, while barely knowing how to manage themselves. They were not given the same high-quality down suits as the elite staff. They were often allocated less oxygen, or none at all for sleeping, to save costs. The dynamic this created was a powder keg. You had clients like Lucas, inexperienced, slow, and reliant on help, paired with staff who lacked the technical skills to perform a rescue or the authority to turn a client around. A seasoned Sherpa knows when to look a client in the eye and say, "No, we go down," A young, underpaid porter, terrified of losing his tip or his job, will keep pushing up until it is too late. This lack of authority was a calculated saving on the balance sheet. The operator saved a few $1,000s in wages, but in doing so, they removed the braking system from a car speeding toward a cliff. The departure for the summit push is usually a moment of high morale and nervous energy. But on the night the budget team prepared to leave Camp 2, the atmosphere was thick with a palpable dread. The team was already fragmenting. The acclimatization rotations had been rushed to save money on food and camp fees. Most physiological guidelines suggest a specific number of days at altitude to generate red blood cells. This team had shaved off 3 days. As they zipped up their suits in the dark, the coughing began. It wasn't the dry kumbu cough common to all climbers. This was wet, deep, and rattling. Several clients were already showing signs of early onset edema, their lungs slowly filling with fluid. In a functioning team, the doctor would have pulled them off the mountain immediately. But there was no doctor. There was only the lead guide, a man who was paid a bonus for every client who reached the summit, creating a direct financial incentive to ignore the warning signs. Lucas struggled to put on his crampons, his fingers fumbling with the straps. He looked at his Sherpa, a boy named Pemba, who looked no older than 18. Pemba's eyes were wide, scanning the darkness, his own breathing rapid and shallow. There was no reassuring exchange of words, no check of the safety harnesses by a veteran leader, just a chaotic shuffling of gear and the harsh glare of headlamps cutting through the spindrift. They moved out into the icefall like a herd of cattle, clustered too close together, stepping on each other's ropes. The pace was agonizingly slow from the start. A climb that should have been a rhythmic military operation was instead a stumbling, disjointed march. The mountain, indifferent to their budget and their dreams, watched them come. Above them, the jet stream was beginning to dip, lowering the ceiling of the death zone, preparing to test the limits of the cut-rate oxygen systems strapped to their backs. The ledger was about to be balanced, not with dollars, but with frozen breath. Everest Base Camp is often described as a city on ice, a sprawling neon metropolis of nylon that springs up every April and vanishes by June. But like any city, it is segregated by wealth. In the center, on the most stable platforms of the Khumbu Glacier, sit the encampments of the elite operators. These are fortresses of comfort, featuring carpeted dining tents, espresso machines, and high-speed satellite internet. Here, the air smells of fresh coffee and expensive freeze-dried stew. But if you walk to the periphery, to the jagged, shifting edges of the moraine, where the rockfall is constant and the ice groans loudly at night, you find the budget camps. This is where Lucas and his team were stationed. The difference was not merely aesthetic, it was structural. Their tents were second-hand, their zippers failing against the biting wind. The sanitation was rudimentary, a hole in the ice, screened by a tarp, that flapped violently in the gale, spreading bacteria through the camp. Sickness spread quickly in these conditions. Dysentery and upper respiratory infections moved from tent to tent, weakening the climbers before the ascent had even begun. In the dining tent, the mood was not one of camaraderie, but of anxious isolation. The food was heavy on starch and oil, cheap calories designed to fill the stomach rather than fuel the machine of the human body. The social dynamic of the mountain is a cruel mirror of the world below. Guides from the prestigious Western teams watched the budget operation with a mixture of pity and disdain. They saw the clients struggling to put on their harnesses. They saw the chaotic piles of gear. But there is an unwritten rule on the mountain. You do not interfere with another man's business. The high-end guides knew that an intervention would lead to a political firestorm with the local liaisons, so they watched in silence. They watched as Lucas sat outside his tent, staring up at the icefall, looking small and defeated, already losing the mental game. They knew that when the push came, these budget teams would become obstacles, human traffic cones in the most dangerous highway on Earth. The segregation at base camp was a prelude to the segregation in the death zone. Those who had paid for a chance to live, and those who had paid for a chance to die. Sound travels strangely in the thin air of the Himalayas. At night, when the wind dies down, the glacier amplifies every noise. In the budget camp, the silence was broken by a chorus of wet, hacking coughs. The Khumbu cough is a notorious affliction caused by the low humidity and cold air drying out the bronchial tubes, but what was happening in Lucas's tent was something far more sinister. It was the sound of fluids leaking into the air sacs of the lungs, the early, insidious rattle of high-altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE. Lucas had been coughing for 3 days. His sputum was pink and frothy, a classic, textbook warning sign that his pulmonary arteries were constricting, forcing blood into the delicate tissue of his lungs. In a well-funded expedition, a doctor would have placed a stethoscope on his chest, heard the crackles, reminiscent of cellophane being crumpled, and ordered an immediate descent or placed him in a gammo bag, a portable hyperbaric chamber. But there was no gammo bag in the budget camp. It was a piece of equipment that cost $4,000 and weighed too much to justify the expense for an operator running on razor-thin margins. Instead, the lead guide, a man under immense pressure to get clients to the top to secure his bonus, dismissed the symptoms. "It is dry air," he told Lucas. "Drink tea. You are strong." This was not medical advice. It was a deflection. To admit the client was sick was to admit the expedition was failing. It was to admit that the acclimatization schedule had been too aggressive. So Lucas lay in his sleeping bag, drowning in his own fluids, convinced by his authority figure that his agony was just part of the Everest experience. He was suffering from a condition that is 100% reversible with descent, yet he was being encouraged to climb higher. The greed of the operator had created a culture where admitting weakness was forbidden, even when that weakness was biological failure. The cough continued, a rhythmic metronome counting down the hours of lung capacity he had left. The Khumbu Icefall is the gatekeeper of Everest. It is a moving river of ice, a labyrinth of house-sized blocks called seracs that can collapse without warning. Crossing it requires technical precision, balance, and speed. For a seasoned climber, it is a place of focus. For the clients of the budget expedition, it was a theater of horrors. Their first rotation through the icefall revealed the depth of their incompetence and the danger of the paper Sherpa model. Lucas reached the first aluminum ladder crossing at 4 a.m. The ladder bridged a crevasse, seemingly without bottom, the dark blue throat of the glacier waiting below. His crampons, dull and poorly fitted, skated on the metal rungs. He froze halfway across, hyperventilating, his knees shaking so violently the ladder began to oscillate. Behind him, a line of climbers from other teams began to form, yelling at him to move. The pressure was immense. But where was his Sherpa? Pemba, the young porter assigned to Lucas, was struggling 50 feet back. He was carrying a load that was illegal by union standards, nearly 40 kilograms of tents and gas canisters strapped to his forehead with a tump line. The operator had overloaded the few porters they had hired to avoid paying for more staff. Pemba was exhausted, his eyes glazed, barely able to manage his own footing, let alone assist a terrified client on a ladder. A guide from a Western team eventually had to clip into the safety line and physically drag Lucas across the gap. It was a humiliating, public display of ineptitude. But the tragedy was that this near miss didn't result in a turnaround. In a sane world, this would have been the end of Lucas's climb. He was clearly dangerous to himself and others. But the budget operator's lead guide simply patted him on the back once he reached the other side. "Good job, you crossed," he said. The standard for success had been lowered from climbing safely to simply not dying yet. They had survived the icefall, but they had burned huge amounts of energy and time, commodities they could not afford to lose. The mountain had taken its first swipe at them and missed, but it was just finding its range. By the time the team reached Camp 2, the advanced base at 21,000 feet, the operational cracks were becoming gaping holes. Here, the altitude begins to strip the mind of its cognitive defenses. Complex thought becomes difficult. Empathy vanishes. It is here that strict adherence to protocols saves lives. But in the budget camp, protocols were viewed as suggestions. The most egregious violation involved the oxygen regulators. The plan, sold to the clients in Kathmandu, was to start using supplemental oxygen at Camp 3. However, as the team struggled into Camp 2, several clients were on the verge of collapse. The lead guide made a decision based on inventory, not physiology. He ordered the Sherpas to keep the oxygen masks packed away. "Save gas," he barked over the radio, one of the few working radios they had. This command was a direct result of the operator's greed. Oxygen bottles on Everest are like gold bars. An unused bottle can be resold next season. A partially used bottle is waste. The operator had instructed the staff to minimize usage at all costs. They were banking on the clients, suffering to save money. Lucas sat in the snow, his lips blue, gasping for air like a fish on a deck, while crates of life-sustaining oxygen sat 10 feet away, locked by administrative decree. Furthermore, the radio silence was deafening. The team was spread out over a mile of glacier, broken into small, struggling clusters. In a professional team, the leader checks in every 30 minutes. Team A, location. Team B, oxygen levels. Here, there was nothing, just the static of the wind. A climber had wandered off towards the latrine area and collapsed, lying in the snow for 20 minutes before anyone noticed. When he was finally dragged back to a tent, he was hypothermic and confused. The guide scolded him for being careless, shifting the blame from the systemic lack of supervision to the individual. The narrative was being crafted in real time. If you fail, it is your fault, not the fault of the company that sent you up here blind and deaf. Then came the weather forecast, the siren song that lures climbers to their doom. In 2019, the meteorological models converged on a single, narrow window, a period of low wind between May 22nd and May 24th. For the budget operator, this window was not an opportunity. It was a trap. A responsible operator looks at the window and then looks at their team. If the team is slow, sick, or weak, a responsible operator says, "We cannot make it in this window, we go down." But the budget operator had no margin for error. They could not afford to wait for a second window. They could not afford the extra food, the extra yak fees, or the extra bonuses for extending the expedition. They had to go now, or they would go bankrupt. The lead guide gathered the exhausted, coughing group in the mess tent at Camp 2. He unrolled a map and pointed to the summit. "The weather is perfect." He lied. It wasn't perfect. It was marginal, with winds predicted to spike late in the afternoon. But he sold it as a golden ticket. He played on their summit fever, that obsessive, irrational desire to reach the top that blinds climbers to reality. He didn't tell them that every other team on the mountain was targeting the same dates. He didn't tell them that the route would be clogged with hundreds of climbers, creating a traffic jam in the death zone. He didn't tell them that their team was statistically the slowest on the mountain and would likely be stuck at the back of the queue, exposed to the elements for hours longer than safe. He simply said, quote, "We go." It was a decision driven by the calendar and the spreadsheet. The herd was moving, and the budget team, like a limping animal at the back of the pack, was forced to run with them, straight into the teeth of a storm that was gathering strength just over the horizon. The illusion of the weather window had been cast, and they were all too desperate to see through it. Before we going to next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this, moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If 1,000 of you are watching, I hope all thousands of you join us because this community is growing and your presence truly matters here. So Camp 3 hangs on the Lhotse face like a collection of colorful blisters on a wall of sheer ice. At 23,500 feet, it is a place of perpetual vertigo. You cannot walk outside your tent. You must clip into a safety line the moment you unzip the door, or you will slide 2,000 feet to your death. It is here that the physical reality of the climb shifts from a hike to a vertical struggle. And it was here that the bottleneck began to form. As Lucas and his team crawled up the fixed ropes, moving at a snail's pace, they encountered the traffic. A single line of rope snaked up the blue ice, and attached to it were hundreds of climbers. This was the conga line the world would later see in viral photos. But for Lucas, it wasn't a photo, it was a prison. He was clipped to a rope behind a climber from another budget team who had stopped moving entirely. The climber was slumped over his ascender, vomiting. In a normal situation, you would unclip and pass. But at this altitude, unclipping is a terrifying prospect. And Lucas, barely trained in rope maneuvers, didn't know how to pass safely. So he waited. He hung on the rope, his heart hammering at 140 beats per minute, burning precious energy just to stay in place. The cold began to seep through his boots. The delay was costing him hours that were budgeted for sleeping and hydrating at Camp 4. The paper Sherpas were helpless. They were stuck in the line too, laden with heavy loads, unable to clear the path. The radio crackled, with the voice of the lead guide from high above, screaming at them to move faster. But physics does not obey screaming. The bottleneck was a physical manifestation of the industry's greed. Too many permits sold to too many unqualified people, all funneled onto a single rope on a single day. Lucas looked up at the line of colorful down suits stretching into the clouds and felt a surge of panic. He was trapped in a queue for the summit, but the ticket booth was closed, and the price of waiting was his toes, his fingers, and perhaps his life. The disaster truly began in the supply tents of the South Colonel at Camp 4, the desolate, wind-scoured plateau at 26,000 feet, known as the gateway to the death zone. This is the place where human life becomes unsustainable. You are dying here, simply by existing. The only thing keeping you alive is the flow of oxygen from your tank. When the team staggered into Camp 4, hours behind schedule, the sun was already setting. They were supposed to rest, eat, and sleep before the midnight push. But chaos awaited them. The Sherpas, who had arrived earlier to set up, were frantically digging through the gear piles. A terrifying realization was rippling through the camp. The regulators were missing. The operator had made a logistical error. In an attempt to save weight and porter fees, they had not brought enough spare regulators to Camp 4. They had assumed the regulators used lower down would be sufficient. But several had frozen or broken during the ascent. Now there were 12 climbers and only 8 working regulators. The scene was one of primal desperation. Grown men, successful in their lives back home, were fighting over mechanical valves. Lucas watched as his lead guide tried to jury-rig a broken regulator with duct tape. This was the equipment he was trusting his life to, a piece of plastic held together by adhesive in -30-degree temperatures. The guide handed him a regulator that hissed audibly. "It is fine," the guide said, his eyes avoiding Lucas's. "Just don't touch the dial." It wasn't fine. The leak meant Lucas would be getting half the oxygen he needed. The greed of the operator had turned a logistical oversight into a lethal game of musical chairs, where the loser didn't just stand up, they suffocated. The point of no return on Everest is not a geographical line. It is a physiological one. It is the moment when your body has consumed so much of its reserve energy that you no longer have the fuel to descend safely. For Lucas, that moment arrived at 10 p.m., before he had even left Camp 4. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. His intuition, that ancient survival mechanism, was screaming at him to stay in the tent. But the pressure of the investment weighed on him. He had spent his savings. He had told everyone back home he was going to the top. To turn back now, while sitting in the tent, felt like a coward's choice. And the guide was pushing them out. "Weather is good. We go now. Summit morning," the guide shouted, clapping his mittened hands. It was a performance. The guide knew the team was too weak. He knew the oxygen was compromised. But his bonus depended on the summit photo. Lucas stepped out of the tent into the pitch-black night. The wind had picked up, driving snow horizontally. He clipped into the rope. His regulator hissed. His headlamp cut a weak beam into the void. He took one step, then another. With each step he moved further away from safety and deeper into the trap. He was walking into the death zone, not as a climber, but as a victim of the sunk cost fallacy. The mountain waited. It didn't need to do anything. It just had to wait for his tank to run dry. The psychology of the false summit is cruel. From below, the south summit of Everest looks like the top. You climb for hours in the dark, staring at a crest of snow against the stars, thinking, just a little further. Asterisk. When you reach it, your soul is crushed to discover that the true summit is still hours away, across a knife-edge ridge of rock and corniced snow. For the budget team, the south summit was the scene of a massacre of morale. They reached it late, far too late. It was 11 a.m. The turnaround time, the strict deadline to start descending, is usually 2 p.m. They had 3 hours left, but they were moving at a pace of 50 meters per hour. Lucas collapsed at the south summit. He sat in the snow, staring at the traverse to the Hillary step. His brain, starved of oxygen by the leaking regulator, was misfiring. He saw people who weren't there. He felt a warm sensation spreading through his chest, a deadly sign of hypothermia. His Sherpa, Pemba, tugged at his harness. Up, up, Pemba urged. Pemba didn't know what else to do. He had no instructions to turn a client around. His only instruction was summit. Other climbers stepped over Lucas's legs. Some looked at him with concern. Others were too focused on their own survival to care. He was becoming part of the landscape. Another colorful lump in the snow. The guide was nowhere to be seen. He had surged ahead with the strongest client to secure his own summit, abandoning the stragglers. The leadership structure had completely evaporated. It was every man for himself on the roof of the world. Summit fever is often described as a mania, a blinding obsession. But in the context of a budget expedition, it is also a contractual obligation. The clients feel they are owed the summit. The operator has sold it to them as a product. At 1:30 p.m., dangerously close to the turnaround time, Lucas stood up. He wasn't thinking about his family or his safety. He was thinking about the certificate. He was thinking about the profile picture. He disconnected his logic centers and lurched forward. He joined the queue on the knife-edge ridge. The traffic was horrific. Climbers were inching past each other on a path the width of a dining table, with an 8,000-foot drop on one side and a 10,000-foot drop on the other. Lucas was now part of the congestion. He was a slow-moving obstacle in a high-stakes environment. Behind him, climbers yelled in frustration. Ahead of him, the line stopped. Someone was stuck at the Hillary step. Lucas stood there, swaying. He checked his oxygen gauge. It read 500 psi. That was barely enough to get down, let alone up and down. But he ignored it. He was seeing the prayer flags on the summit. They were so close. He could almost touch them. The greed of the operator had placed him there, but his own ambition was now holding the gun to his head. He took another step. He had crossed the line. He was now climbing on borrowed time, and the interest rate was infinite. The Hillary step is a 12-meter vertical rock face, the last great obstacle before the summit. Historically, it was a technical climb. Since the 2015 earthquake, it has changed, becoming a snow slope, but it remains a bottleneck. On this day, it became a parking lot. Lucas arrived at the base of the step to find 30 people waiting. The line was motionless. A climber at the top was struggling to descend, tangled in the old ropes. No one could move up. No one could move down. They just stood there, burning oxygen, freezing in place. For 20 minutes, Lucas stood still. 20 minutes in the death zone is an eternity. The body generates heat through movement. When you stop, the cold invades instantly. His fingers began to numb inside his mittens, the sensation of wood replacing flesh. But worse was the oxygen. His leaking regulator hissed away his life supply while he stood helpless. He looked around. To his left, the Kangshung face dropped away into Tibet. To his right, the southwest face fell into Nepal. He was suspended in the sky, trapped by the sheer volume of humanity. The climber in front of him, a woman from an Indian budget team, suddenly slumped against the rock. She was out of oxygen. Her Sherpa frantically tried to change her bottle, but in the chaos, he dropped the wrench. It clattered down the rock and vanished. The panic in her eyes was primal. This was the reality of the crowded mountain. A single mistake, a single delay, cascades into tragedy. The traffic jam wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a mass casualty event in slow motion. It happened silently. There was no alarm, no flashing light. Just a sudden increase in the resistance of each breath. Lucas sucked harder, but the air wasn't there. His tank was empty. The panic that followed was immediate and overwhelming. He ripped the mask off his face, gasping for the thin, cruel air of 29,000 feet. At this altitude, the air pressure is 1/3 that of sea level. Every breath feels like you are suffocating. He turned to Pemba, pointing frantically at his back. Pemba checked the gauge. Empty. He reached into his pack for the spare bottle, but the spare bottle wasn't there. It had been left at the south summit to save weight on the final push, a decision made by the absent lead guide. Pemba stared at Lucas, his face a mask of horror. He offered his own mask to Lucas, a gesture of supreme sacrifice. But Lucas, in his hypoxic delirium, couldn't figure out how to attach it. He collapsed onto the snow, right in the middle of the path. Climbers stepping around him cursed, annoyed by the obstacle. They didn't see a dying man. They saw a piece of luggage blocking their way. Lucas lay there, staring at the sky which was turning a deep, bruised purple. His brain began to shut down non-essential functions. Vision narrowed. Sound muffled. He was running on empty, stranded in the most inhospitable place on the planet, a victim of a business model that calculated fuel to the last drop and missed. Abandonment is a harsh word, but on Everest it is a practical reality. Above 8,000 meters, morality warps. You cannot carry an incapacitated adult down the mountain. It is physically impossible for most people. If someone cannot walk, they usually stay. The lead guide descended past Lucas 20 minutes later. He had summited. He had his photo. He stopped briefly, looked at Lucas lying in the snow, and checked his pulse. Lucas groaned. He was still alive. But the guide made a calculation. To try and drag Lucas down would risk his own life and the lives of the other clients. And the guide was tired. "He is gone," the guide told Pemba. "Leave him." Pemba protested. He was crying, tears freezing on his cheeks. But the hierarchy was absolute. The guide ordered Pemba to descend. This was the ultimate betrayal of the client-guide relationship. Lucas had paid for protection, for expertise. Instead, he was being discarded like a spent oxygen canister. The guide clipped into the rope and continued down, stepping over his client. The contract was voided by survival instinct. Lucas was left alone, tethered to the safety line but untethered from the world of the living. As the sun dipped lower, the hallucinations began. The brain, starved of oxygen, begins to fire randomly, creating vivid, comforting delusions to ease the passing. Lucas saw his kitchen in Ohio. He saw his wife making coffee. He felt warm, pleasantly warm. This is the warm bath of hypothermia, the final stage before death. He unzipped his down suit. He took off his mittens. He began to talk to people who weren't there. He had a conversation with his father, dead for 10 years. He apologized for being late to dinner. To the climbers passing by, it was a gruesome sight. A man sitting in the snow, half undressed, mumbling happily to the wind. This phenomenon is common in the death zone. It is the mind's way of protecting itself from the horror of the reality. Lucas didn't know he was dying on a ridge in the Himalayas. He thought he was home. The tragedy was absolute. He was dying in a place of supreme beauty and supreme indifference. his mind retreating into memory as his body froze into a statue. The mountain was claiming him, not with violence, but with a gentle, terrifying madness. Before we going to next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this. Moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If 1,000 of you are watching, I hope all thousands of you join us, because this community is growing and your presence truly matters here. So down at Camp 4, the bargain guide sat in his tent, drinking tea. He knew Lucas hadn't returned. He knew Pemba had come down alone. But he didn't grab a radio. He didn't organize a rescue party. He made a decision to wait. To launch a rescue at night in a storm is suicide. But it is also expensive. It requires sending Sherpas back up, using more oxygen, risking more gear. The operator's protocol was clear. Protect the assets. The Sherpas were assets. The gear was an asset. The dying client was a liability. The guide reasoned that Lucas was likely already dead. Why risk more lives for a corpse? It was a cold, brutal logic, but it was also a cover for cowardice. He didn't want to go back out into the cold. He didn't want to face the consequences of his failure. So he simply zipped the tent door shut and turned off his headlamp. He chose to sleep while his client froze. This decision, the decision to do nothing, was the final act of greed. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the hoarding of effort, the refusal to spend even a calorie of energy to save a life that had already been written off as a loss. Night falls differently in the death zone. It doesn't just get dark. The world disappears. The stars are aggressively bright, unblocked by atmosphere, hanging like shards of ice above the ridge. For Lucas, left on the cornice near the south summit, the night was a physical weight. The temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The wind picked up, scouring the ridge with spindrift that filled the folds of his unzipped suit. He was no longer hallucinating. The warm comfort had faded, replaced by a dull, encompassing nothingness. His body had pulled all blood from his extremities to the core. His hands were white, hard as wood. His feet were blocks of ice. He was sitting on a cornice, an overhanging shelf of snow formed by the wind. Beneath him was air, thousands of feet of it. He was clipped to the rope, but the rope was just a line of nylon. It couldn't offer warmth. It couldn't offer air. He was a solitary figure in a cosmic void, a tiny speck of dying biology against the indifference of the universe. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sporadic, ragged gasps of his own failing lungs. He was the loneliest man on Earth. Around 2 a.m., a climber from a different team, descending late after his own struggle, came across Lucas. In the darkness, Lucas was just a shape blocking the path. The climber clipped his safety carabiner around Lucas's rope, effectively using Lucas's body as an anchor point to rappel down a steep section. He didn't realize the anchor was a human being until he was past him. He looked back up and saw the headlamp, dim and flickering. He saw the eyes, open and frosted over. He realized with a jolt of horror that he had just used a dying man as a piece of gear. This is the grim utility of the dead on Everest. They become landmarks, green boots, the German woman, and now Lucas, he was becoming part of the route. The climber paused, debating whether to check for a pulse, but his own oxygen was low. He made the same calculation everyone makes. He kept moving. Lucas was no longer a person to be saved. He was an obstacle to be navigated. He had transitioned from a climber to a feature of the terrain. Back at base camp, the operator's radio sat silent on a folding table. The family of Lucas, thousands of miles away in Ohio, was refreshing a tracking website. The little dot on the screen hadn't moved in 12 hours. They called the agency. The operator lied. "Radio is down," he told them. "He is resting at Camp 4, very tired, but safe." This is part of the business model. Manage the narrative until the end. To admit a death is to invite bad press, investigations, and insurance nightmares. So they stall. They create a fog of war. The operator knew exactly what was happening. He knew the guide was in the tent. He knew the client was missing. But he sold hope to the family to buy himself time to formulate a story. It was a cruelty that matched the physical suffering on the mountain. The silence of the radio wasn't technical failure. It was a wall of deception built to protect the brand. The rescue that never came was not a failure of ability. It was a failure of will. At Camp 4 there were other teams. There were strong Sherpas from elite expeditions. If the budget guide had run into the other tents, screaming for help, offering money, offering anything, a rescue might have been mounted. But he didn't. He stayed in his sleeping bag. He was afraid of the judgment of the other guides. He was afraid of admitting he had abandoned his client. Shame is a powerful silencer. Throughout the night, Lucas lay there. Perhaps, deep in his freezing brain, he waited for the sound of boots. He waited for a voice. He waited for the promise of the brochure to be fulfilled, that he would be taken care of. But the only thing that came was the wind. The hours ticked by, each one stripping away another layer of life. The rescue was a fantasy. The reality was a man alone, paying the ultimate price for a discount ticket. The morning light on Everest is spectacular. It hits the summit pyramid first, turning the rock gold, then pink, then a blinding white. It is a moment of pure beauty. At 5:30 a.m., the first climbers pushing for the summit from the next wave reached the cornice. They found Lucas. He was curled in a fetal position, his unzipped suit filled with snow. He was frozen solid. The climbers stopped. They took photos, not of him, but of the sunrise, carefully framing him out of the shot. They stepped around him, clipping and unclipping their safety lines. The traffic jam began again. The cycle of the mountain reset. Lucas was now part of the history of the 2019 season. He was a statistic. The sun warmed his suit, but it could not warm him. He sat there, a silent sentinel, watching the next group of dreamers march past him toward the top, unaware that they were walking in the footsteps of a ghost. The night was over, but for Lucas the darkness was permanent. When the season ended, the numbers were tallied. 11 people had died on Everest that spring. It was one of the deadliest seasons on record, but not because of an avalanche or an earthquake. There was no act of God. The weather, while tight, had held. The mountain had not shaken. These were man-made deaths. 9 of the 11 deaths were linked to budget operators. The correlation was impossible to ignore. The bodies were the receipts of the transaction. Lucas was brought down a year later, his family paying a fortune for a retrieval mission that cost more than the climb itself. His body was stiff, preserved perfectly by the cold, a time capsule of his final moments of agony. The industry absorbed the blow. The deaths were categorized as altitude sickness or exhaustion. The specific failures, the leaking regulators, the missing radios, the inexperienced staff, were glossed over in the official reports. The body count was a line item, a cost of doing business. The mountain was cleaner, the bodies removed, but the system that produced them remained intact. The denials came swiftly. The operator, Mohan, sat in press conferences in Kathmandu and blamed the climbers. They were weak, he said. They did not listen to Sherpas. They hid their sickness. It was a classic strategy, victim blaming. He painted Lucas as a stubborn, arrogant Westerner who refused to turn around. He didn't mention the pressure from the guide. He didn't mention the oxygen shortage. He spun a narrative of personal responsibility to deflect from corporate negligence. The government of Nepal, reliant on the millions of dollars in permit fees, nodded along. They announced new rules that required climbers to have experience, rules that everyone knew would be impossible to enforce and easy to fake. The denials were a shield wall, protecting the golden goose of Everest tourism. The truth, that cheap operators were killing people was too inconvenient to admit. In Ohio, a living room remains a shrine. Photos of Lucas on training hikes line the mantelpiece. His wife holds the refund check from the operator, a partial refund for services not rendered. It is an insult. The grief of the families is compounded by the lack of answers. They have the autopsy report, hypothermia, cerebral edema, but they don't have the why. They don't know about the missing regulator. They don't know about the guide sleeping in the tent. They connect with other families online, a network of grief forms. They share stories of broken equipment and ghosting operators. They realize they are not alone. Their loved ones didn't just die, they were processed. The grief turns to anger, but anger has nowhere to go. The operator is in Nepal, shielded by borders and bureaucracy. The money is gone. The husband is gone. All that remains is the silence of the empty house. The following spring, the tents went up again. The same operators, some under new names to dodge bad reviews, set up shop on the glacier. The prices were even lower. Flash sale. Everest 2020. The industry did not change. If anything, the demand grew. The viral photos of the traffic jam didn't deter people. They advertised the accessibility of the mountain. If that many people are there, the logic went, it must be doable. New clients arrived. They signed the same waivers. They were handed the same recycled oxygen bottles. The cycle repeated. The lessons of Lucas's death were buried with him. The market demands a cheap Everest, and the market provides. As long as there are dreamers with limited budgets and operators with limited morals, the conveyor belt will keep running. The true cost of a cheap Everest climb is not $30,000. It is the slow, lonely death of a father on a ridge at 28,000 feet. It is the trauma of a young Sherpa forced to abandon a human being. It is the degradation of the mountain itself, turned from a sacred peak into a commercial slaughterhouse. Lucas thought he was buying a discount. He didn't realize that on Everest you pay for everything eventually. If you don't pay with money, you pay with physics. You pay with biology. We must remember these stories not to demonize climbing, but to understand the value of a human life against the ledger of profit. When you see a low price tag on a dream, ask yourself what has been removed to make it fit. Because up there, in the thin air, where the line between life and death is drawn in oxygen, the bill always comes due. And sometimes, the only currency you have left is your last breath.